And she is presenting in tandem with Serenity Dufay. Serenity Dufay is an English major graduating from the University of Bahamas this spring. She's of Haitian descent and a native of Grand Bahama, studying Haitian-Bahamian relations and its connection to Bahamian literature. She has a love for reading novels and writing fiction, and she hopes to pursue an MFA in writing and aspires to be a published author and to teach English at the college level. Their paper is Nula, the Haitian Other in Bahamian Drama.
Good day, everybody. Can y'all hear me? Okay, so it was said earlier that Bahamian writers do not really speak about the nation or national development when it comes to novels and stuff. But what me and Dr. Bethel found was that drama is what many Bahamian writers turn to talk about race relations, to talk about the state of the country, and to offer social commentary. So we found from the early 1970s, even till the 2020s, generations of writers have sought to explore the relationship between Bahamians and Haitians through the medium of theater. And I will begin with an excerpt from Diary of Souls. Respecte mon ke mori. Peye no sa o dwe no. Nola. Libere no. Nola. Libere no. Libere no kolye a. Which translates to respect me who died. Pay us what you owe us. We're here. Free us. We're here. Free us. Free us now.
The Haitian Other, Problem, Question, Stigma. The place of Haitians in Bahamian society is conceptualized variously as a problem, Marshall, 1979, a question, Sears, 1994, and a stigma, Fielding et al., 2008. Other scholars such as Bethel Bennett, Louis, Perry, and others have noted the overwhelming negative construction placed on the figure of the Haitian in Bahamian society. Haitians suffer discrimination under the law, are subjected to structural violence, are rendered stateless under the Constitution. However, Bahamian drama provides alternative perspectives.
4 plays will be given a close reading to explore how Bahamian playwrights have wrestled with the concept of the Haitian other on stage. We have Turner's Women Take Two, written in 1979, Boodle's The Landlord, written in 1982, Bethel's The Children's Teeth, written in 2008, and Strawn's Diary of Souls, written in 2006.
Telsine Turner's award-winning Women Take Two, written, I think, in 1979, but published in 1987, is set in the pre-independence 1970s. The main character, Lionel Joseph, is an ambitious young Mason whose dreams are destroyed when he becomes caught up in his boss's machinations. Although Lionel is legally Bahamian by birth, the audience is first introduced to him through the words of his girlfriend Beverly's Aunt Merline, who refers to him as a half Haitian. Audience sympathies for this character are evoked by Beverly's response. He's not half anything. He was born here just like you and me. He is all Bahamian, all man, and all mine. So the time when we first see Lionel, he is burst into his boss's office, and he meets his boss's daughter, her 16-year-old daughter, sitting there. And he's really angry. And after explaining why, which I won't go into, he then tells Sonia, the daughter, how he plans to make his last name known across the whole country. He plans to give his present employer competition, and he underscores his ambition by singing a song that he's made up on the spot, "It's Best to Be Your Own Boss," at which moment her father enters. Harold Davies clearly disapproves of what he meets in his front office. His manner is cold and dismissive, but Turner subverts audience expectations. It is not clear whether Davies' disapproval is connected to Lionel's ethnicity, or to his occupation, he's a Mason, or to his apparent interest in his 16-year-old daughter. At no point in this scene does Davies mention Lionel's Haitian heritage. His objection initially appears to relate to class, not race.
We find later, though, that Lionel's ethnicity becomes pivotal. The central conflict in this story derives from the fact that 60-year-old Sonia is pregnant. If Lionel will marry Sonia and make the child legitimate, Davies will rename the company Davies, Joseph and Son Construction Limited. He's seeking a favorable reputation, a favorable marriage for his daughter because she was impregnated by a politician with his own family. So he comes up with this elaborate scheme to get Lionel to marry Sonia. In no other way, he argues, can Lionel hope to realize his dreams of owning his own construction company. His name, Davies argues, will be the obstacle. Don't say your pa was Haitian, that he lived in a chicken coop and had to scrape grass for a living. Nothing wrong with scraping grass. It was honest work. At least I think so. But not everyone is like me. They hear your name and the only job they consider giving you is mending their pants or picking garbage from their yard. Work your ass off wouldn't make much a difference. They'll still bring their real work to Johnson or Smith, no matter if Johnson is drunk from sunup to sundown, and Smith specializes in sloppy work and millionaire prices. No, you see, Johnson and Smith are all Bahamian, whatever that means.
Lionel's rejection of this proposal brings about his downfall. Harold Davies mentions that Sonia's pregnant and implies that Lionel is going to marry her when he meets Lionel's fiancée. This scheming brings Beverly's latent prejudices to the surface. This is the same individual who was defending Lionel in the first scene. In a final argument with Lionel, she reels off some of the very insults that she once defended him against. You no good, two-timing, double-crossing, scrawny-necked, piss-tail, low-down Haitian freak. And this creates a break in Lionel's character. At that point, he becomes bent on destroying everybody. And this is what he says, and this is the first time that we see a relationship or him consciously identifying with his heritage. I'll show her. I'll show all of them. No good double-crossing Haitian freak, eh? I'll really freak you out. Freak all of you out. How? Metal? No, that's too easy. No, make them squirm. Do it from the inside. That's the way. Break them from within. Make living dead out of them. Boss of the living dead, me.
Yet, as Turner shows, anti-Haitian sentiment in the Bahamas runs deep. It is the corrosive nature of that prejudice that ultimately drives the play to its final outcome. While there is little othering happening on the surface, the prejudice is always there, eroding the fine intentions and sentiments, and leading ultimately to destruction.
The second play is The Landlord by Sam Boodle. Written during the same era as Woman Take Two, The Landlord by Sam G. Boodle does not focus on the stigma many Haitians face. Of all of the plays under consideration, it provides the most optimistic treatment of all. When the audience first meets him, Willie Paul, the lead character, is trying to woo Olga, the Bahamian love interest. At first, she rejects him. When he asks why, she replies, I don't like Haitians. Olga is like those Bahamians who do not distinguish between Haitian nationals and those of Haitian descent who were born in the Bahamas to Haitian parents, which Willie Paul is. They are all grouped in the same category and hated alike. But ultimately for Olga, we will see that this prejudice is superficial. Charmaine Perry, in It's Better in the Bahamas, argues that it is the stigma of being Haitian that greatly shapes the everyday lived experiences of people of Haitian descent, born or raised in the Bahamas. It is being born to Haitian parents that define Haitian Bahamians and impacts their lives negatively. Like Lionel Joseph, Willie Paul is a legal Bahamian. He's born in the Bahamas before independence of non-Bahamian parentage. He is a legal Bahamian, but he is still seen as Haitian by Olga in this case.
So when Willie gets this comment by Olga, I don't like Haitians, he has a very interesting response. He addresses the comment head on. He defends his parents as good, hardworking people and proclaims that he is a Bahamian regardless of where his parents come from. He states, my navel string buried here. Willie is a Bahamian of Haitian descent, and this is something that he embraces, not rejects. In Better in the Bahamas, Perry recognizes that as respondents grew older, most seemed to embrace their Haitian heritage and express pride in who they are, who their parents are, and where their parents come from. So in her study, she interviewed several Haitian Bahamians, and while being Haitian was something that they tried to hide, especially growing up and during their schooling, as they grew older, they found a sense of pride in being Haitian, wanting to speak Creole more in public, and also celebrating Haitian Flag Day. So Willie's line after this is striking. He says, "We got to drop the stigma." His use of we instead of you or they illustrates how he perceives himself. He does not see himself as the other. He views himself as a Bahamian. Though he is not part of the problem, he links himself with the social group responsible for the problem. Willie inhabits a unique position. His Haitian heritage causes him to be othered, yet his Bahamian identity causes him to feel responsible for the stigma.
It is telling that Boodle chooses to start his play with this discussion. As a mirror, it reflects the audience's internalized attitudes towards Haitians. In confronting Olga's prejudice, Willie succeeds in breaking down her inherited disdain. What is more, Willie becomes a force that confronts the audience with its own prejudices. Still, Willie stands apart as the only Haitian living in the yard, and one person continues to other him, and that's the person in the top right corner. This is Miss Mabel Newton, the comic relief and the antagonist of the piece. Her negative comments, which are consistent throughout the play, reflect Fiona Joseph's view in the treatment of Haitians in Bahamian society that, quote, "Many in this community may be suffering insults as a result of their ethnicity, or at least endure conversations which attack Haitians." Ms. Mabel is a constant reminder that, for some people, Willie will never fully assimilate into Bahamian society. But she, in this play, is alone in her sentiments, as is shown by Olga's defense of Willie later in the play.
Despite Willie's claim to being a Bahamian, which is legitimate since he was born before 1973 and became a Bahamian, it's largely unrecognized by those around him. Joseph states that Haitian Bahamians are looked at as Haitians first and then Bahamians, and in some cases they are not even acknowledged as Bahamians, even after they became registered citizens of the Bahamas. Ultimately, Willie is able to overcome the stigma of being Haitian. This is illustrated in Willie finally marrying Olga. Her initial prejudice aside, Olga learns to accept Willie for who he is. Though he will always have the shadow of his Haitian heritage, Willie's character in The Landlord stands out as a positive example of a Haitian Bahamian character in Bahamian drama who is able to succeed in his goal despite the stigma he faces.
The third play, The Children's Teeth, by Nicolette Bethel. This play demonstrates how Haitians are alienated in Bahamian society and can never find a place where they truly belong, even in situations where they appear to have a home. In this play, the Haitian character, Dieudonné, called Donnie by her relatives, was adopted into the Williams family and raised as if she were their own child. Every family member is aware of her identity. She is the illegitimate daughter of the father of the household, Neville Williams, by an immigrant Haitian woman. Though there are constant references to this fact, Donnie paradoxically occupies a privileged position in the family.
For Ellie's mother, Blanche, the roles between Haitian and Bahamian have been reversed, claiming, "You see how this bitch got all yin around her, like you was the Haitian and she was somebody?" Blanche views Donnie as an enemy, echoing the common view that Haitian immigrants are trying to take over the Bahamas. Perry notes in Invasion from the South that, quote, "Bahamians fear the presence of the Haitian community in the Bahamas and believe they are a threat to the cultural and national sovereignty of the Bahamas." Unlike Willie Paul, Donnie resists being othered. She responds to Blanche's insults that "this is my house too. I got every right to be here." This statement is more than rhetorical. Bethel soon reveals that this home is hers, as Neville left part of the house to her in his will. Even so, Donnie cannot properly be integrated into the family. Unlike Willie, who embraces both the Haitian and Bahamian sides of his nature, Donnie is disconnected from her Haitian mother and her heritage and culture because she was born in the Bahamas. She's also distanced from her Bahamian family by Blanche's lack of acceptance, Ross's anger, Stacy's resentment, and ironically, the extremity of Ellie's welcome.
So I just want to backtrack a little bit because we had to cut this down from the length. And we cut out a really important part because y'all have no idea who Ellie and all these people are. So the family is Donnie, who is the adopted daughter, the mother, the wife of Neville, whose name is Ellie, and she welcomes Donnie in. And then everybody else in the family who have different welcomes, different relationships with Donnie. And in the end, it is the friction in these relationships that brings about the final conflict. So, like many of Haitian descent, Donnie lacks a space to call home. Her Haitian identity has displaced her. There is little to connect Haitian Bahamians to the land of their parents, yet the only land they have ever known refuses to accept them. Due to not connecting to her Haitian mother, Donnie tries to find herself a belonging and home in her Bahamian father. She states to Stacy, her sister, "You don't know what it means to me having a home. I never had a home. Daddy was the only thing I ever had that made me feel like I belonged somewhere." Donnie embodies the struggles of Haitian Bahamians with belonging and identity. Haitian Bahamians find that they do not belong either in Haiti or in the Bahamas. Charmaine M. Perry in Invasion from the South notes that due to citizenship laws, many Haitian Bahamians are not citizens in the Bahamas or Haiti.
It is at the very end of the drama that Neville reveals that Donnie was conceived out of a violent rape. This is left to the very last scene of the play, which makes the revelation all that more shocking. "Hold her down," he say to us. "I ga fix her." So we hold her down, and he get up and start undoing his pants. We hold her the whole time he fixing her. And she keep her eyes closed the whole time he doing it. And every time she make a sound, he knock her. Then when he finish, Handy gone. After him was Sparks. And when he finish, it was my turn. And when we all finish, Hilly knock her one more time, and then he spit on her, and we gone to deal with the rest of the raid. And then I gone in that outhouse, and I see what we do to her. So she could be my child, for all I know. She could be Hilly own or Handy, but she could be my own.
So the incident that is being described here comes about because Neville was a police officer who had been ordered to carry out raids on behalf of immigration. And this is a moment that has haunted him throughout his life and after his death. The treatment described is cruel and yet shows the reality of Haitians living in the Bahamas. At any moment, they can be taken away and sent back to Haiti. There is no sympathy given for their situation or their families. There is a constant fear of deportation. This indicates that the othering of Haitian migrants in Bahamian society seeps into how they are treated on every level. This is a systemic issue, as the immigration officers and the police are instigating the injustice and victimization of Haitians at this point.
Neville's revelation changes Stacy's relationship with her sister. For their entire childhood, Stacy was very, very rude to Donnie because of the privileged position she had in the house, where Donnie would be the one who'd sleep on the bed, and Stacy was forced to sleep on the cot. So the story of the rape and her father's culpability in it jars Stacy into finding sympathy for Donnie. This realization comes just in time for Stacy to save Donnie's life. As Ross, that's the brother of the family, threatens Donnie with a gun to force her to sign over her interest in the house, Stacy steps in front of her sister and is killed. For Bethel, it is not enough simply for attitudes to change. The injustices perpetuated by Bahamians against Haitians are too deep and destructive. In this play, healing requires sacrifice. Our next play is Diary of Souls by Ian Strachan. And this play tackles the issue of Haitian migration to the Bahamas head-on, using a real-life incident as a departure point. So on July 10th, 1990, the HMBS Yellow Elder, a Defense Force vessel, intercepted a sloop carrying an unknown number of Haitian migrants in the southeastern Bahamas, in the region of the Exuma Keys. For reasons which have never been fully explained, the people on board the sloop were not brought onto the Bahamian ship, but remained on their vessel to be towed to Nassau. When this capsized or broke apart, reports differ, all on board were thrown into the sea. despite the efforts of the Defense Force officers who launched boats and dived into the ocean to rescue over 60 migrants, at least 39 perished. The bodies which were recovered were landed on a nearby Exumian island, where they were prepared for a hasty burial.
The event had a lasting impact on several of the Defense Force officers themselves, many of whom were treated for post-traumatic stress symptoms in the wake of the event. One of these officers, a fictional individual by the name of Ishmael, is a key character in Strawn's play. When the audience first sees him, he's under the care of a psychiatrist following an emotional or mental breakdown.
The leads are 2 men and 1 woman, Paul, Titon, and Sylvie, who appear in the first scene of the play on a beach. Titon is shouting for a boat to return, while Paul is lost in melancholy and Sylvie sits in a trance. In this long first scene, the audience learns that these characters are in fact ghosts of 3 dead Haitian migrants, stuck for some reason in a limbo between life and the afterlife. Their task is to discover what ties them to the world of the living and prevents them from passing over.
Diary of Souls illuminates the tragedy of the real event through its depiction of the horrific hole on the beach. Titon describes the shallow grave as having, quote, no coffins, some in plastic bags, some with no covering whatsoever. Everyone was wearing what they died in. They were flung in, some with feet in the air, some in all sorts of crooked directions. The corpses of the Haitians who died in the event are unidentified and desecrated. Haitians in the Bahamas are treated with little respect during life. This scene suggests that this disrespect is continued in their death. In viewing Haitians as other, they are no longer considered humans worthy of respect. Perry notes that all of the adjectives Bahamians use to describe Haitians articulate that they, Haitians, are considered non-human beings.
Burton M. Lewis states in The Haitian Diaspora in the Bahamas that, quote, this anti-Haitian sentiment is more than prejudice. It is a necessary ingredient in contemporary constructions of Bahamian ethnic identity. I believe the speaker before us mentioned this as well. The Haitian other being put against the Bahamian self. So the Haitian identity is actually intentionally created in the Bahamas as the other through stigma and prejudices. This is depicted in the following dialogue. Sylvie, we are very black. Titon, very black? Sylvie, it offends them. Titon, but they are black also. Sylvie, we are very black and poor. It offends them. While most Bahamians do not deny that they are black, they believe that Haitians inhibit a different, more extreme form of blackness. This racialization of the Haitian identity, which arises from white supremacist concepts, is placed as opposite to what is believed to be Bahamian. Strawn suggests that Bahamian society accepts itself as black, but also scorns Haitians for being too black. Perry explains that they have racialized Haitians as being distinct from Bahamians, arguing, for example, that you can tell if someone is Haitian because of their short stature, dark complexion, and as being less modern, in essence, more African than Bahamians.
At the end of the play, redemption is gained because the Defense Force officer, Ishmael, makes a pilgrimage back to the island where this event happened and performs a ritual of reconciliation. And the very last scene of the play is with the 3 ghosts and Ishmael sitting, eating a meal together. And part of his ritual is him saying, forgive us. We are foolish and ungrateful. Give us your blessing. I will remember and never forget. I've come to pay my debt. This resolution conveys the message that mere acknowledgement of the tragedy is not enough. There must be an actual understanding between the 2 parties. Strawn's inclusion of such a powerful scene expresses the need for remembrance and reconciliation. The tragedy has altered all concerned, Ishmael and Paul, Titon and Sylvie. Bahamians must ask for forgiveness and respect the dead. Healing is needed to take Haitians from the periphery of Bahamian society and invite them into the center, where, like Ishmael, Bahamians and Haitians can sit as equals. So, just a short discussion. One of the things that we discovered when we were looking at this, and there are more plays, this is something that comes up again and again and again in Bahamian plays. It's part of us. But plays written within the first 10 years of independence, such as Woman Take Two and The Landlord, emphasize the Bahamianness of their Haitian characters. But those written after 1992, after indeed the first generation of people born in an independent Bahamas had reached adulthood and had started experiencing the challenges faced by children of foreign parents seeking citizenship, that is the plays like The Children's Teeth and The Diary of Souls, these plays emphasize the difference. In the plays written near the turn of the 21st century and beyond, while the Haitian characters remain sympathetic, the treatment of the Bahamian characters undergoes a critical change. Donnie, Titouan, Paul, and Sylvie force Bahamian audiences to confront their prejudices head on, and they do not flinch from portraying extremes of hatred in the process.
In short, the plays written within the first 10 years of independence tends towards a more optimistic view of the anti-Haitian sentiment they portray in their society. Turner and Boodle both recognize it, but they present it as an individual thing, something that, despite Willie's acknowledgement of collective responsibility, emanates from people rather than society, law, and structure. For them, the hurts are personal, and there's a sense that with education and open-mindedness, individuals can change. But Bethel and Strawn, writing at the turn of the 21st century and beyond, present their society's anti-Haitian actions as a collective, even cosmic error. Both Bethel and Strawn go beyond the natural world to portray Bahamian anti-Haitian hatred. In both plays, ghosts are pivotal. It is as though for them, the society's treatment of Haitian immigrants is a sin of such magnitude that it must be atoned for in one way or another. Like Stacy's sacrifice in The Children's Teeth or Ishmael's ritual at the end of Diary of Souls.
Strange to be in the unenviable position to ask people to stop talking about my work, but that's what I just had to do. Where it felt strange. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Nyambi Hall Campbell Dean. She's Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of the Bahamas, and she is Chair of the Bahamas National Reparations Committee. Dr. Hall Campbell Dean is trained as an Afrocentric community psychologist whose work primarily focuses on the use of culture as a tool for the empowerment of those within the African diaspora. This has led her to work with the Indaba Project, Critical Caribbean Symposium Series, and to co-found with her husband, the King of the Conch Fest, a Bahamian culinary conservation competition with the mission to preserve conch and culture for Bahamian generations. Her professional appointments and honors are both local and international, and include International Relations Chair of the Association of Black Psychologists and Alpha Kappa Mu Honors Society. Her paper is Underdevelopment and Independence, a Case for Reparations. Nyambi Hall Campbell Dean.
Good afternoon. I changed the title a little bit. So it's now Underdevelopment and Independence, Pay Me What You Owe Me. And so I begin with this slide. This is a picture of Jackson Burnside's painting, The Navel String. When, upon one of my visits home, when I was in grad school, I visited with my paternal grandmother, who's now since passed. And she asked me, you know, how's it going? You know, how's school? And I went into, oh, it's so hard and it's so much work and, you know, it's so isolating. And she listened and she nodded her head and she looked me in my eyes and she said, I always wished I could go to school. And that changed everything for me. And so this work is dedicated to my ancestors who always wished that they could go to school, specifically my grandmothers, Ida Hall and Orion Johnson. And also to my educational support, my grandmother, who's from my godmother, sorry, who's from Grand Bahama, so I can't come to Grand Bahama without speaking her name, Dorothy. So for this presentation, I just want to give you a run through. I was thinking that I was going to be sophisticated like the English persons and not do slides. And then I talked with Dr. Davis and he changed my mind, so slides there are. And so I want to start with the objective indicators of Bahamian underdevelopment, go into the original conflicts, speak on Bahamian education development as conflict, and then end with a Bahamian case for reparations. So as we talk about these objective indicators of Bahamian underdevelopment, I'm reminded of the Zora Neale Hurston quote in which she says, if you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. And so we start off with recognizing our pain, that 50% of mortality and morbidity in the Bahamas is due to crime and non-communicable diseases. In 2015, the leading cause of death for males in the Bahamas was homicide. So if you woke up male in 2015, the most likely way that you would die was that somebody killed you. We saw some of these numbers from Gina Rogers-Seeley's presentation, right? But this is just another reminder that in 2003 to 2013, there were 6,000, and I have in italics reported, right, cases of gender-based violence in the Bahamas. And then to get to education, since that's what I'm going to be talking about, the BGCSE results, and I should have the result, the year up there. If this is for 2022, that 12.9% of students taking the BGCSE scored a C and above. And so we know that there are some problematics in the way that the BGCSE results are reported, right? But still, it just kind of helps to locate us. And so we state those conflicts as where we are, but we have to do that within the context of remembering the original conflicts, right? And so I use this picture of this artistic rendering, and I do not have the artist up there, I have to get that, of Christopher Columbus, right? The original conflict. So from him to slavery to the statue of Woodes Rogers to colonization, we see that the original conflicts were set up in the country. And it's no mistake that these conflicts also outline Bahamian education development in the Bahamas. And so I start that with this quote from Creighton and Saunders, which says that the curriculum in the public and private sector never permitted nor provided for people of African ancestry to know their reality. And so when we look at the Bahamian educational context, we note that it starts with Bahamian education as a place of evangelism. So the institution of formal education was more of a directive of colonial powers than the request of the people. It was plagued with instability. Bahamian education had a turbulent inception and consistently relied on foreign influences to help sustain it. The story of Bahamian education can be categorized into three main areas, the first of which was catechism or evangelism. According to Turner, 1968, classroom curriculums were more akin to Sunday schools, as the Christian catechism was the primary lesson. In framing the formal history of Bahamian education, the essential role of the church and establishing and maintaining influence in the system was paramount. The Education Act of 1816 required that all teachers be members of the Anglican or Presbyterian Church, but the Baptists, with their majority black members, and the Methodists, with their strong loyalist populations, were also pivotal in organizing primarily Sunday school education. The second and third purpose of education for African people in the Bahamas was subjugation and colonialization. Throughout the 19th century, the desire to propagate colonialist ideals and impart religious knowledge became the motivating factor for the establishment of formal education in the country, especially amongst the newly emancipated population. The Educational Act of 1822, for example, pulled all funding from the system, citing financial constraints, and the first non-secular school open to both males and females was established in 1832, but closed only 3 years later. The newer Educational Act of 1862 made education compulsory, but the majority of Bahamians couldn't afford it. Sustainable secondary education, although racist and elitist, would not be established then until the founding of Queens College. Sorry, Nicolette. And Chris. Sorry. In 1871. All-inclusive public secondary education was then established in 1925 on the grounds of the current University of the Bahamas with the government high school. And while a very important institution in regards to national development, it was staffed primarily by New English expatriates who continued to promote colonialist ideals. After World War II, towards majority rule, Bahamian education took some major strides, but perceptions of Bahamians' views of education were still limited. The Houghton Report on Education in 1958 stated as much by saying, "Small wonder that many prosperous Bahamians seem to think education and training are far from essential, either for individual or community, since they themselves have prospered exceedingly without much of either. Small wonder, too, if humbler people would have the same thought, since the boom conditions of today, they find they can obtain work, and lucrative work too, in spite of an almost complete lack of training." Although myopic, Houghton's statement suggests that formal education itself was at the time irrelevant to the Bahamian culture due to the economic circumstances, and questionably set a precedent for the value of education in the country. Subsequent reports, such as the Hope Report in 1968 and the Ministry of Education White Paper of 1972, entitled Focus on the Future, called for a radical reorganization of the system on Bahamian education as it was deemed narrow, meager, ill-suited, and irrelevant. In 1974, Education in an Archipelagic Nation, the most comprehensive report of its kind to date, established that education needed to be Bahamianized. It was assumed that a national development plan was required for the country so that Bahamian education could follow. The report warned that simply replacing expatriate teachers with Bahamians would not achieve Bahamianization, and warned against undermining the procurement of knowledge and talents outside of the Commonwealth in this Bahamianization effort. In an attempt to locate perspectives on education after the country's independence, Masick, 1976, interviewed 12 key Bahamian education informants to determine their perspectives regarding the direction and needs of Bahamian education. Through these interviews, 5 main areas were established. 1, attitudes of Bahamians towards education and schooling. 2, the relationship between the educational system and the Bahamian economy. 3, the role of schools in the development of family island economies. 4, the imbalance of educational system in favor of academic over technical education. And 5, the effect of geography on the educational and economic development of the Bahamas. Recognizing the effects of colonialism on the educational system, many of those interviewed called for an alignment of the culture of Bahamians' perceptions of education with the economic and developmental needs of the burgeoning new country. So while a great effort was being made to Bahamianize education, the conceptual framework concerning the new educational ideals, Bahamian education, with the conceptual framework concerning the educational needs of the new Bahamian was unclear. From the passing of the Emancipation Act, in which the motivation to provide education was to simply and explicitly maintain a colonial order amongst the newly freed Africans, to 1957, when the Bahamas had the lowest ratio, and that's what this ratio is, to 1957, when the Bahamas had the lowest ratio of persons with a secondary education to those with a primary education, 1 in 67. In the entire Caribbean, Bahamian education was lacking a truly Bahamian agenda. Majority rule and the new establishment of an independent nation created an environment in which the goals of education were able to borrow from the newfound goals of the country. Bahamianization was purported as a new educational mandate, but within this burgeoning culture, persons that could effectively operationalize this concept and then explicate it within education were either few or underutilized. The result was a system that reflected a first-order change in which the names of the schools and the persons within them were Bahamian, but the curriculum and agendas remained foreign. In effect, we were never permitted to know the reality of who we are as a people, and this is why we, in the Bahamas National Reparations Committee, call for reparations. Reparations for the crimes against humanity of the genocide of the native peoples of this land, the unspeakable atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade, and the massive underdevelopment of colonization. In the CARICOM reparations 10-point plan, well, first let me outline what reparations is. So, you know, when people hear reparations, the first thing that they think about is just money. But reparations really is about justice. And so we see from this quote of Sir Hilary Beckles, who's pictured here in a meeting with Glasgow University, who made some reparations for their role in transatlantic slavery, that reparations is a process of repairing the consequences of the crimes committed and the attempt to reasonably remove debilitating effects of such crimes upon victims and their descendants. And so CARICOM does have a 10-point reparation plan, and this 10-point plan is actually under development as we speak. But it includes a full and formal apology, right? Not statements of regret, as we have come to be familiar with. Repatriation. This is a picture in 1896 of African Americans loading is shipped to Liberia, right, with the Marcus Garvey movement. The indigenous people development programs. This is a picture of the Colonialism in Dominica. A group of people, honestly, I'm ashamed to admit how old I was when I realized that there was a thriving population of indigenous people still living and thriving in the Caribbean. Cultural institutions, development in our cultural institutions. Awareness of our public health crisis. The African descendant population in the Caribbean has the highest incidence in the world of chronic diseases in the forms of hypertension and type 2 diabetes. We know that in the Bahamas, we are ranked 6th in the world in rates of diabetes, right? So these non-communicable diseases that we are dying from is not specific to the Bahamas. This is a regional problem. African knowledge programs so that we can know the truth about Africa, right? This is a true map of the size of Africa, and you can see the United States fits in there, China fits in there, all of Europe fits in there, right? But we don't know these things. Psychological rehabilitation so that we don't get stuck in the sunken place, right? And then, last but not least, eradication of illiteracy. As is noted on the CRC website, at the end of the European colonial period, in most parts of the Caribbean, the British, in particularly, left the Black and indigenous communities in a general state of illiteracy. Some 70% of Blacks in British colonies were functionally illiterate in the 1960s, when nation states began to appear. So we in the Bahamas National Reparations Committee stand in the legacy of Bahamians like John Boyd, a self-taught free man who published the first book of native Black Bahamians in 1834, called The Vision, and other poems in blank verse, who led massive letter-writing campaigns to advocate for the emancipation of all enslaved Africans. And we remember that approximately a year ago, Bahamian school children were pulled out of their classrooms to pray to extend the life of a queen whose ancestors stole, pillaged, raped, and enslaved and subjugated them. So I wanted to end on the viral letter that the Bahamas National Reparations Committee wrote on the occasion of the visit of her ancestors. This visit commemorates 70 years since Queen Elizabeth's ascension to the throne of imperialism, more years than the Bahamas has been a sovereign nation. The Bahamas National Reparations Committee asserts that we as Bahamians must have a clear understanding of what this trip truly means. We are not beholden to the British monarchy in any way, and we do not owe them a debt of gratitude for anything, not for our culture, religion, or system of governance. Instead, the monarchy has looted and pillaged our land and our people for centuries, leaving us struggling with underdevelopment left to pick up the pieces. In the words of Sir Hilary Beckles, colonialism was devastating, and we are tired of footing the bill. We are tired of paying literally with our lives for the maintenance of a paradigm in which we were exploited so others could be exalted. It is time now for reparatory justice. The time is now for reparations. The CRC is a regional body created to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the reparations by the governments of all former colonial powers and the relevant institutions of those countries to the nations and people of the Caribbean community for their crimes against humanity. The first point of this plan for governments of Europe is to offer a full and formal apology for their crimes against humanity. The Duke and Duchess may not be compelled to make such a declaration during their visit to our shores. They may not be able at this time to speak on behalf of the Queen and their government. However, they can no longer ignore the devastation of their heritage. They and their family of royals and their governments must acknowledge that their diverse economy was built on the backs of our ancestors, and then they must pay. As God and the ancestors would have it, this royal visit to the Bahamas falls squarely on the 15th anniversary of the United Nations International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. We, the children of those victims, owe it to our ancestors to remember. We owe it to our ancestors to demand a reckoning and to demand accountability, healing, and justice. In the words of our great ancestor, Tony McKay, also known as Exuma, the Obeah man, they must pay me for my blood in the water, pay me for my son and my daughter, pay me for my brothers and sisters, pay me for all of my dead, pay me for the blood that you shed, pay me what you owe me. I come to collect everything that you owe me. Reparations now.
Final speaker is Michael Stevenson. And, okay. He's associate professor in the Department of Law in the School of Social Sciences at the University of the Bahamas. Teaches and conducts research in the areas of constitutional and administrative law, human rights law, jurisprudence, criminology, sustainability law, and policy and law and society. He started his academic career at the college in 1990, the then College of the Bahamas, and has served, among many other roles, as a former head of the Department of Law. He was a member of the Constitutional Reform Commission and a member of the University Transition Legislative Drafting Committee. Mr. Stevenson recently stepped down from his position as Acting General Counsel and University Secretary, for which I still have not forgiven him, a position he held for 8 years, resuming full-time teaching and research. His paper is entitled Legal Repression, Legitimization, and the Rule of Law in the Bahamas. Michael Stevenson.
Thank you. The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting, Milan Kundera. Law is a tool of forgetting. Yours truly. Paper, Legal Repression, Legitimization, and the Rule of Law in the Bahamas. So the background framing of the problem that I'm looking at is, one, the conditions that made the quiet revolution quiet. That was the original impulse, and that led me to think about the nonviolent resistance to slavery and colonialism, which has been the case in the Bahamas, generally. And then thirdly, as a framing of the paper, what was the enduring sort of coloniality sort of characteristic? In other words, neocolonialism, and why has it remained with us? And all those three framing sort of conditions led me to think about the role of law and the relationship between the rule of law ideology and the ways it makes us forget our history. Thank you. So I define legal repression as the social ordering that comes about via the immoral subjugation of a group of people, where the people subjugated see the law only as a tool of their immoral subjugation. And the modality of law that's at play here is command and brute force. And against the idea of legal repression is another concept of law, which I argue emerges during slavery. And that is a sense of law as an ahistorical, objective, transcendental check on arbitrary rule. This is problematic. People will ask the question, how do you think that slaves could have developed a sense of legal ideology given the horrible conditions in which they were oppressed precisely because of law? But I'm arguing that there's a way of thinking about a nascent, emerging legal ideology amongst slaves, even under slaveholding conditions. And I'm looking at this in 3 historical periods. During the slaveholding period, primarily the 18th century, in the immediate aftermath of emancipation, and then more specifically during the Quiet Revolution, which I put on the board, on the slide as roughly 1953 to 1967. So in my paper, which I'm going to cut out this part, I talk about legal repression, and we were all familiar with the horrible slave laws that existed and defined slaves as the black population as basically chattel. But what is missing from the account of law in relation to slavery, I argue here, is, and I'll read this. What is missing from this account so far, and other accounts of the brutal treatment of slaves and their formerly enslaved after emancipation under imperial rule, is an account of the way law was perceived by those brutalized by the law of slavery and colonial rules, such that we can begin to reconstruct the legal subject's understanding of the meaning of law beyond its obvious repressive, terrorizing character, if there was such an understanding. And so the question I'm asking, how does the non-repressive function of law emerge within the slaveholding societal context? And I've listed a few sort of factors here, which I think can explain this idea of an emerging nascent legal ideology amongst the enslaved. One, and this is hard to say, there was an emulation of white racist identity logic, meaning that law for whites was a way of separating themselves from black folk who they looked down upon. It was a mark of their identity, a mark of their superiority in their own eyes. Unfortunately, that was emulated. The idea of that white value was emulated by slaves. That's the argument. The other factor in terms of an emerging nascent legal ideology was that slaves saw that law could serve as a constraint on white power. In other words, they saw white people taking each other to court and using the law as a constraint amongst themselves. And that was significant to them, I would argue. There is also this idea that the British Empire and the rule of law under the British Empire represented something that was important. And they understood British law as exercised and operated by the metropolitan center as something very other than local rule. And I would argue that for many folk living during slavery, black and white, they saw British rule of law as something to aspire to emulate. And then there's finally another source for the emergence of this legal ideology. The use of the Negro courts by especially the black loyalists. My colleague, Chris Curry, has done some marvelous work on looking at the social history of the black loyalists. So the question I asked then, well, how do you square this emerging understanding of the rule of law with the idea that rebellion and revolt would have been at the forefront of those who were subjugated during the slaveholding period? How do you reconcile those two sort of positions? Well, one is possibly that you could hold those two positions when you had very deep suspicion of the rule of law. The other idea is that the rule of law as a nascent ideology was actually a driver of the seeds of potential rebellion. And then thirdly, there is the age of revolution in which the slaveholding period sort of was coincidental with. When you think about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, which occurred at the end of the 18th century, these were revolutions that were getting people to think about human rights. And this idea about liberty and freedom and how that related to the rule of law would have been present, I think, in the minds of those who were enslaved. Post-slavery legal repression and the rule of law. I'm going to skip through this section because in terms of time, but there are factors that I argue similarly relating to the slaveholding period, which suggest that during the post-emancipation period, you had this continuing sort of emergence of a rule of law ideology in those who were formerly enslaved. Again, I point to white-on-white litigation, which I call it. And then most importantly, I think we have cases where you have the subjugated population bringing actions in the courts against whites. The Caesar Brown case is a case I would all ask you to look at. And Chris Curry talks about this particular case in his social history of the black loyalist. The Kate Moss case is very instrumental and important and instructive here. And then you have the Lightbourne case. These are all very important cases in our legal history of early instances of blacks taking whites to court, and I would argue blacks understanding that law could be used as a tool in their defense. The Quiet Revolution, and I'm going to now switch, if I may, to my script. I've outlined so far a framework for understanding the origins of a rule of law ideology amongst the black population of the Bahamas under conditions of slaveholding and in the immediate aftermath of slavery. An argument can be made that the Quiet Revolution in the Bahamas is proof of a rule of law ideology taking hold across Bahamian society. But given the position earlier stated regarding the compatibility of the rule of law and slave rebellion, the question arises, why did the black masses not take the route of violent rebellion during the period of the Quiet Revolution? To break free from colonial rule and the rule of a small white economic and political minority committed to white supremacist rule. Answers to this hard question allows the linkage between the rule of law ideology and its legitimization function to be explored. One set of possible partial explanations already hinted at, based on the reception of the rule of law, amongst the many other factors that may have shaped that relatively nonviolent political process in Bahamian history, is that law came to be increasingly relied upon in the post-slavery colonial setting as a tool seen as a legitimate for ordering society and governance and bringing about change. As already noted, emancipation itself, though it certainly did not bring about immediately all the trappings of liberation or an immediate reversal of the intolerable conditions for black folk created by slaveholding, represented a seismic constitutional reordering in the imagination of the ex-slave and free colored folk of what obedience to law could mean for freedom. In short, law was seen as the vehicle of formal emancipation, a constraint on white power, and a promise of what it could be wielded in the right hands. And arguably, slowly it began to be seen as an institution that could not be easily reduced to the demands of white power. The role of the metropolitan colonial power in constitutional development of the Bahamas forms the backdrop of this transition, where rebellion recedes into the background of imagined courses of action to break free of local and colonial white rule. To greater understand this role, it is important to point out that post-emancipation, appeals for greater political and economic freedom by the majority population were made to the governor and Secretary of State for the colonies. White imperial power was not seen by the majority black population exactly the same way they saw the local white oligarchy, the latter of whom were more often than not seen as untrustworthy, corrupt, self-serving, and racist. It was a view of the local white political and economic elite, often also shared by the representatives of the imperial colonial power, who presented themselves as defenders of liberty, the rule of law, and representative democracy. The racial common cause between local white political elites and the white imperial power was their shared position regarding the unreadiness of blacks to assume positions of political power. Though this racist commonality would have acted to restrain the development of a fully embraced constitutionalist mindset in the majority black population, arguably it did not disrupt imperial rule being seen as somewhat of a neutral, overseeing arbiter of island governance with the power to limit governmental action, consistent with the notion of a society ruled by law and limited government. And then I look at sort of a kind of a overview of constitutional history from the 18th century into the sort of up to the Quiet Revolution, which I'm going to skip over in the interest of time, but I am going to pick up this development as it relates to the franchise. So some account of the history of the franchise and political representation in the period of the old representative system is now needed to go deeper into the question of the deepening attachment to the rule of law and the further retreat of rebellion in the minds of black folk living under white colonial and local rule. Pre-emancipation under the old representative system, voters in the Bahamas had to be male, free, white, over the age of 21, residents of the Bahamas for at least a year, and owners of land. In 1807, black males owning property were allowed to vote and stand for election to the House of Assembly. And by 1834, there were 4 non-white males sitting in the House of Assembly, which increased post-emancipation to a complement of 6 by 1889. By the end of the 19th century, to vote required a freehold property qualification of 5 British pounds or a household tenancy just over 2 pounds, despite the franchise remaining limited in the Bahamas until the middle of the 20th century, and white political rule not being challenged until around the same time with the formation of the PLP in 1953, the first political party in the Bahamas, and the start of the Quiet Revolution, the governance system was seen to be gradually moving in the direction of political equality. Moreover, the system was adapting and slowly reforming through legal changes in the constitutional system under the watch and control of the Crown, seen intent on ensuring order under law. At the same time, this interpretation of constitutional development is a source for the internalization of constitutionalism, and the rule of law must reconcile this claim with the historical reality of political corruption practiced during that period and well into the 20th century, and the lack of political direction amongst black representatives in the House of Assembly during that same period. In this regard, Dr. Gail Saunders writes that the colored middle class in the period 1890 to 1942, quote, lacked a strong political tradition. While she acknowledges that black men in the House of Assembly expressed independent positions on a range of matters, she argues that, quote, there was never a significant enough number of them to form a coherent bloc against the white mercantile elite, which dominated the House of Assembly. This cannot be the complete picture. As in 1889, there was many blacks in the House of Assembly as a number that made up the Magnificent Six under the PLP banner in 1956. A more accurate depiction then of black middle class political leadership up until the formation of the PLP in 1953 is that for a possible variety of reasons, it lacked the capacity or will to politically organize a coherent political bloc against white power. It was not about numbers, as Saunders later in her own analysis suggests. Other sources confirm this problem of middle-class political leadership, black leadership, prior to the introduction of party politics in the Bahamas. At the end of the 19th century, Governor Shea is reported to have said in response to the 6 black representatives sitting in the House in 1889 that, quote, the colors elected were of little significance, as the question of race or color was scarcely heard of, and that their presence would, quote, not be the cause of any inconvenience, end quote. Magistrate Powell in The Land of the Pink Pearl also confirms the problem when he writes at the end of the 19th century that, quote, the colored people have not yet learned the art of political organization. Linked to this problem was the problem of political corruption and the methods used by white political power to maintain political control. Concerning political corruption, Colin Hughes writes that white political power was maintained not through a restricted franchise, but by means of corrupt elections. An insight into the problem at the end of the 19th century, which lasts into the modern era of Bahamian politics, can also be gleaned from a commentary of Magistrate Powell. He writes, and I quote, this mockery of representation is the greatest farce in the world. The colored people have the suffrage, subject to a small property qualification, but have no idea how to use it. The elections are by open voting, and bribery, corruption, and intimidation are carried out on and in the most unblushing manner under the very noses of the officers presiding over the polling booths. Nobody takes notice, and as colored people have not yet learned the art of political organization, they are powerless to defend themselves. The result is that the House of Assembly is little less than a family gathering of whites, nearly all of whom are related to each other by blood or marriage. Laws are passed simply for the benefit of the family, whilst colored people are ground down and oppressed in a manner that is a disgrace to the British flag. How do these social and political dynamics relate to the argument so far about the entrenching of the rule of law imagination? Saunders has put forward the argument that the emergent colored and black middle class in the 19th century after emancipation, while suffering racial discrimination themselves, this grouping chose to mimic and acquire white values and, quote, look down on the black laboring class. Saunders argues that this class, for the most part, focused on advancing themselves educationally and professionally and maintaining their respectability, all the while distancing themselves from the black masses. Saunders constructs a general profile of colored political leadership after emancipation and well into the 20th century, that because of white political power, the fear of losing respectability and, quote, an increasingly comfortable lifestyle was unable and unwilling to identify with the downtrodden masses in society and politically organized as a political bloc in radical support of them. She writes, quote, while colored and black leaders realized the blatant injustices and hardships under their laboring classes lived, they lacked the political will or machinery to effect change. They were willing to negotiate for a gradual, peaceful solution. The colored and black middle class could not condone violence or risk ruining its increasingly comfortable lifestyle. Class-wise, it still found it difficult to identify with the black laboring class. What comes through with this analysis is a strong class-based, self-interested, individualistic, and socially fragmented outlook emerging as part of a release of emancipatory energy. A mirror of the same attitude amongst the laboring class, in emulation of the colored and black middle class they looked up to, expressed itself through the outlook of a short-term self-interest embedded in the laboring class's participation in the political corruption practiced by the Bay Street Boys. With the emergence of a legalistic rule of law outlook rather than a revolutionary mindset, the adoption at the same time of a strong form of individualism driven by putting self over community-based interests suggests a clear distinction being forged in the social imagination of the majority population between their fidelity to official power and law and personal circumstances arising out of private decision-making. The tendency towards social disorganization amongst the black majority population in post-emancipation Bahamas should not come as a surprise, given the total socially uprooting, alienating, and destabilizing effect of slavery and white power based on white supremacist beliefs. But what is missing from this analysis is the function of legal ideology in enabling the black middle and laboring classes to live with this situation. An ideology of law offered a transcendent stability organized around certainty, judicial independence, and rational objectivity, a social anchoring for a community undone by the traumatizing rule of white power. But it also offered something else. It offered a way of living with social fragmentation born of slavery and a way of forgetting a history ruined by slavery. For with the ideology of the rule of law came the claim that political power ruled by law and under law could potentially generate formal equality. In this equation, law and justice would be presented as a blind, neutral, and overseeing power, permitting the ups and downs produced through social intercourse in the shadow of law's blindness, within the social arena demarcated by law and constituted by it through its permissions and prohibitions. That arena where life happens and is seen as separate from the formal machinery of justice and state power. The fiction that is implanted in the social imagination by this ideology is that all social relations under the rule of law are the outcomes of, go to the next page, next slide, yeah. Social interactions, and which are free and disconnected from the rule of formal power. And through this subjection, through this obedience to law, seen as distant and autonomous, the ideology speaks of a freedom that is constituted precisely because of this ideological projection of law's withdrawal from social life and the effect of a voluntary subjection to law perceived as uprooted from history, eternally existing, and that promises freedom and a social center in return, is the normalization of all social life for the sake of some sense of social cohesion, even if that social life is based on a socially fragmented, ruined history. And arguably, the most extreme effect of this process of normalization is the presentation of all that is the legacy of that ruined history, the continuing traces of a slaveholding-based white supremacist framework inscribed in thought, economic, and institutional structures as a product of a natural process disconnected from the operations of formal rule. In summary, the rule of law was slowly adopted because it was based on the values of the white overlords' indoctrination program. It also represented the values of a colonizing power, seen as an overseeing justice to be emulated. At another level, however, the law and its ideological support functioned as a center that might hold against a social world fragmented in the wake of the trauma of enslavement, and was seen as a tool that held the potential for social and economic advancement and a constraint on white power. None of these explanations are mutually exclusive. They all operated as parts of a system that ultimately functioned to decouple. This is a very important part here. They all operated as parts of a system that ultimately functioned to decouple law and a formal rule from history in the social imagination and normalize historical injustice and its legacy of social disorganization in the process. I'm going to stop there.
Let me hear it right to the podium.
Yeah.
Hopefully change your mind. I look forward to reading your paper, though. So, ladies and gentlemen, we open the floor now for some questions. Perhaps someone would be so kind as to, is there a mic we want to circulate? We want to circulate that one, and I give them. Here's one to circulate.
I had a hand and then I went and got the mic. This is for Michael because I was doing some business before that, so I didn't hear the other three. Sorry, it's AMMC stuff. But Michael, you were talking about an ideology really that was tied to an awareness of law and how it might be used in a way by enslaved persons. As you know, I had looked at the what Lord Dunmore called Negro courts, how it created a political space where they could actually have their cases of freedom heard. And 90% of the time, of course, they did not have a favorable ruling. But the fact that they had a political space is telling. The other thing is, I have looked at the historiography on what we might call black abolitionist ideology, because even people like Michael Creighton, who some of us might revere as noted scholars and historians, he himself has said that he never gave enough attention or thoughtfulness to an ideology that enslaved persons absolutely possessed. And in fact, Hilary Beckles has taken him to task and said that endemic to all enslaved persons was a desire for freedom, and they always, from the outset, declared war on slavery. And their very acumen, their political acumen, was actually seen in their praxis. In other words, what they did rather than what they wrote. As we all know, they were often denied opportunities for education, could not communicate in the written sense of the word, and so they used their feet, their hands, their mouths, every part of their being to rebel, to declare war on slavery. And so it's their praxis, what they actually did rather than what they wrote, that is more telling. So the way I look at it is persons like Pompey and the other 43 that were enslaved and stole Lord Rolls' vessel and headed for Nassau, it's telling that they knew exactly where to go. They thought, allegedly, that James Carmichael Smith was a sympathetic abolitionist, and you could debate whether he was or not, but what's more important is they knew where to go. And I think enslaved persons needed to be given more credit for the ideas and ideologies that they espoused on the ground, that they were the ones that really pushed the whole issue of slavery being abolished to its more natural end. The white abolitionists in England very much conservative, and we're all about reforming the institution of slavery rather than actually abolishing it. So it took people like Pompey and Sam Sharp and Toussaint Louverture and others to actually move them from gradual or reform-minded individuals to actually abolishing it. So my question is really about, how do you see ideas being articulated when we don't have a legal framework necessarily in place outside of the British legal system? How do you see them acting upon a system that is not really set up for their advantage, but they're able to sort of find ways to use it, if you understand me?
I mean, I think basic response is, I think, and you alluded to it, Chris, and that is there was realism about the law amongst the enslaved population. They understood that they couldn't get justice out of the system. I mean, there was so much discrimination in terms of the judges who made the decisions. It was just filled with discriminatory practices and prejudices. And yet, there was a promise that they held on to. I think that's what's missing in the historiography, is that understanding of how a legal consciousness emerged based around a promise that they projected into the law itself. They detected a potential, and I think that is the basis of the ideology. And let me not say for 1 minute am I advocating that the rule of law and the emergence of this legal consciousness was necessarily a good thing. I'm a critical legal scholar, and my first impulse is to think that the rule of law ideology comes with a tremendous downside, and the downside is the decoupling of law from history. And as I try to drive out in the end of my analysis, is that in this forgetting of history because of the decoupling of law from history, this idea that the law is somehow transcendental and above the social fray, is the normalization of our ruined history. And so much is lost in that normalization.
Yes, just following up on what Chris mentioned there, I think what's missing from your piece is the very earliest impulse against slavery here. Hilary Beckles mentions it in his work on slave uprisings in the Caribbean. One of the very early, probably one of the first few uprisings took place here in the Bahamas. Corino, who nobody talks about, he's written out of our history books. For some reason, nobody, even successive Bahamian governments, has ever mentioned him as a hero. But he had a vision very early on that rejected the whole idea of the British legal system. His idea was total rebellion and to overthrow the existing form of governments, to kill all the white men, not the women and children. So he wasn't inhumane, but all of the white men, because he saw the patriarchal nature of the oppression. So it showed a political consciousness on the part of Corino. And I think here what you have, I think, I don't think you capture that essence of very early on what Chris talks about, this love of freedom by all enslaved persons. And that's why to this day, what you hear in that letter to the Duke and Duchess when they came here is the resonance of this demand. Payment, what you owe me. Pay me for the blood of my ancestors.
Yeah.
So I understand your essence of your argument with law. I would go deeper into it, but I know we're short of time. Just one point I make. The Somerset case didn't end slavery in Britain.
No.
So you have newspaper advertisements in Britain long after the Somerset case where the rewards for runaway slaves. The essence of the judge who made that decision was he wished they'd come to some solution that he didn't have to make a ruling.
Right.
He didn't want to rule, but he ruled.
Right.
And even he's one of the. I won't go on. He had a black child. It's a lot of history behind his decision. So, but it's not, I read your paper because I know you had to rush through it, and I think I will have to respond to it.
Please do.
Yeah. Well,
Please
be our
do.
forum. Niambi could tell you.
Just a quick response, right? Just a quick response. And Chris, I'm going to critique you for a second. Chris's book, you have to read it. It's a beautiful, wonderful book on the black loyalist. My critique, though, is in Chris's book, he talks about this impulse to liberty. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the development of a legal consciousness, an ideological organization of thinking around legal ideology that I think explains a lot about the enduring coloniality that we maintain in this country. The decoupling of law, because of this legal consciousness, from history, explains so much of what we just pass by and normalize. So the impulse to liberty is clearly there, and for obvious reasons. But what I'm speaking to is, how do we explain non-violent resistance because of that emerging legal ideology? And I'm pretty sure that it's not just legal ideology that explains that non-violent resistance. There's other things happening. I just happen to be focusing on the legal ideological component.
I want to respond, but I want to give Nico the chance to jump in, and then I have something I wanted to add to it.
So I guess my real point of starting is being an anthropologist, to say that we should not forget that the enslaved people brought their own customs and understandings with them. And so maybe what you're talking about, Michael, is not a growth, but a recognition of the fundamental justice of the things that rang true to them, and then a critiquing of the things that were oppressing them. That's what I wanted to say.
That's actually a critique I have on the slide of
Oh.
myself.
That's cool.
I say here,
Give him the mic.
African customs around law, order, and government.
Yeah.
I did not take that into account. I have to learn that myself.
Yeah, I want to add something too. I feel like what you're talking about is a little bit of how a class of a political movement in the post-1953 era, which was rhetorically about creating an egalitarian society, created in a way, pacified the revolutionary impulse, and then legitimized the class structure, while admitting maybe it allowed for new entries, right? But it actually did nothing to threaten essentially the plantation economy that we had. But what I wanted to add was, what's interesting about our politics is that even while the rule of law was the official rhetoric, was the posture of the black professionals who led the majority rule movement, there was still a practice that admitted a marriage with illegality. In other words, there's no real story of the Bahamian modern state, or even of the social struggle. You can't talk to where am I going with this? You can't just talk about you can't just talk about
Two infidels together and talk about the weather.
you can't just talk about the PLP's fight with the UBP, right? Without talking about the role the numbers man played, which was illegal in fighting white merchant class power. And you can't even now talk about the political machine today without talking about its relationship with underworld, anti-establishment, criminal elements. I mean, look at who's hitting the street, with the MP campaigning, in the tough neighborhoods. You know what I'm saying? So there's this, and there's a lot of work about this in the Jamaican context, right? So there are unspoken, unofficial, yet very real, illegal, if you want, criminal, anti-establishment, even violent elements that get co-opted, mobilized, contained, co-opted, right? To yes, ultimately serve the entrenched structure. But there are some areas where it's frayed, it's not completely clean. And of course, what Chris and Dion have been talking about is the consistent running away, resisting, outright rebellion, and even attempts to set up parallel societies that have taken place throughout slavery itself, which were automatic challenge to the order, right? That's going on. But I think even in the established middle class progressive liberal party movement, they recognize the need for forces that weren't invested in law and order at all, or the rule of law, right? Now you can say they exploited those elements, and both sides still do to some extent, but it's there, and it kind of messes up the paradigm a little bit, I think, in your analysis, which I look forward to reading.
Yeah, just a quick comment, if I may. I think another part of the history that needs to be told about the Quiet Revolution is this very, very deliberate decision-making within the party not to go down the course of violent resistance. There were some serious deliberate choices not to go down that path. And that was within a framework of a rule of law ideology that was already firmly in place within the thinking of many of our initial leaders.
When CR walk in here, Friday go down and talk to those fellas and try to calm things, and they're like, right. They basically couldn't persuade them not to put down their sticks in their clubs. And they should put it down anyway.
Are we still live? I want to say some things.
Okay. Okay. So my question is in reference to reparations. So, if reparations are granted, what is hoped to be gained by that? Is that going to solve the black minority problems? What is hoped to be gained if reparations are granted?
Well, yeah, we think more in terms of when, right? Reparations will be granted. And I say that because sometimes I think when we talk about reparations from the perspective of people of African descent, it is viewed as if reparations is a novel idea, right? But reparations have been paid to multiple communities for years, right? So reparations, as I was trying to relate in the presentation, is really about justice. We know that the work of healing doesn't come from the person that inflicted the harm, right? But that you have to heal on your own. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it helps if, you have money to buy the Band-Aid, money to buy the ointments, to aid with the healing. And so that's what we think that the goal or the purpose of the reparations would be. Thank you.
No, I think I was here. Okay, so while we are on the topic of reparations, I've mentioned to Dr. Dean that we shouldn't wait just for the 10-point plan. We should have an internal plan, right? And I say that because we know the families that benefited from our ancestors' suffering. We know those families, like the D. Albinuses, No, we could ask them, or rather you could tell them, not ask. You could tell. You can tell them that you participated, you chose a side, and these are the consequences of choosing that side of history. Also, I think about, if not that, we could also put sanctions on those businesses that benefited from, like these are real internal things. We shouldn't just wait on the 10-point plan. I don't want to wait to die to get my money. Or whatever we're going to get. We could have something else. We need to have an internal plan that says, okay, justice can be restored in this way to us, the descendants of the enslaved people who lived in the Bahamas. And I think that these are the uncomfortable conversations we need to have. And calling their names, we know the families. Y'all grew up with them, right? I'm only experiencing this as I read history. But some of you know the families intimately. And the question is, what are we waiting on?
Right. I think, and so the CARICOM Reparations Commission is now in its 10th year, and when it was initially formed, the idea was to advocate to the former colonial governments, but now we see the movement morphing where you have non-state actors actually engaging in reparations, like the Trevelyan family in Grenada just made a $100,000 commitment to the University of the West Indies, right? And so those are absolutely conversations that we are starting to have, even in terms of, when the reparation comes, what are the forms, what are the structures in place for us to receive, right? The reparations. We have issues with Crown land now that we don't have access to as Bahamians. So those are all things that as the movement progresses that we're questioning and have to put in place for sure.
Okay, hi. I just wanted to say that the presentation on the Haitian presence in the Haitian community and how we perceive that in drama was fantastic. I totally relate to the characters because I'm one of the speakers, and my last name is Ajigal, and y'all could tell I ain't no Bahamian name, right? So growing up, I actually wanted to change my name so bad to Fitzgerald, which is my mom's name. And then, as I got older, like you said, I realized how prideful I am and how wonderful that is to be two things, right? So thank you for that. But I wanted to ask you, Dr. Campbell-Dean, about, so genetic diseases, I know they're inherited through DNA. So, that your ancestors' trauma will actually affect your genetics and how you heal and how your health manifests, right? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know more specifically about the public health crisis. What kind of restorative justice do you think, how would that work in terms of helping us get our public health crisis fixed? I know that's so random, but I just was wondering.
Again, I think it's in terms of the funding of it, right? And that really it's up to us to frame it. Indira Martin has done some really amazing work, Bahamian biologist, on that very issue, the epigenetics of trauma on enslaved persons. And so we have people in the community that are doing this work, right? That could say, okay, well, you could come and frame my study. You could come and fund my study, when those types of issues arise. Yeah.
That was supposed to be the last question, but we have...
One more question. We have lots of hyphenated names hyphenated ethnicities in the Bahamas. Bahamian Greeks, Bahamian Lebanese, Bahamian Chinese, Bahamian whatever. Bahamian Haitians, Haitian Bahamian, I should say, I should turn it around. These hyphenated names. How much does color play in denigrating hyphenated names?
Um,
And I'm saying that because you were saying Bahamian blacks said they black, but Haitians are blacker. Very black.
Yeah.
That's where I'm going. How much impact does it have?
So I don't know what Serenity is going to add, but what I would do is to turn it around and turn it into a question, because our whole thing was looking at what is remarkable to me, and we only picked 4 plays. What is remarkable to me is that in this body of literature, which is the richest literature that we have in terms of full-length explorations of the Bahamian condition, in every single decade that people are writing about the Bahamian and the Haitian situation, not about Greek Bahamians or Chinese Bahamians or others. So I can't answer your question except to say that this is an abiding thing. We are in our 3rd generation of Bahamian playwrights who are writing about this. We didn't talk about that group because we just dealt with full-length plays. But we're in our 3rd generation and people are still writing about this. This tells us something, I don't know what, about our psychic relationship here. I am pretty convinced, and I think that, I can let Serenity say it, but I'm pretty convinced that the concept of Africa as the source of savagery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, this internalized self-hatred is at the bottom of it. But, and that's part of the answer you wanted me to give you, but I think that it's a question that we can ask. Why is it that this is a recurring theme in our plays, generation after generation after generation?
Yes, it's very, very interesting. So as we saw in the excerpt, they were like, why do they hate us? And the Haitian ghost responded, well, we're very Black. And so as Phil already said, it has to do with like this internalized like self-hatred, also racism. I believe that a lot of times Bahamians view Haitians as like darker skin tones. So it's even a layer of colorism as well, in seeing that that many Bahamians perceive Haitians as being this more extreme form of Blackness, that they're more racialized. I feel as though, like when I was looking a lot of research on this topic, Bahamians more want to align themselves with the British, and we don't want to, I guess, necessarily identify with Africa at times. And because Haitians, they seem to us to embrace that more, we seem to demonize that.
Okay, Mike, do you want to have one final word on on the exchange we had before we close, or you good? Nyambi, any final word? All right. Listen, this has been really lively. Thank you all so much. We're gonna give our presenters a hand.